Imagine for a moment that you are a peasant in medieval Europe. You've been told all your life that the church is the only way to heaven, and you have no reason to disbelieve it. But for most people, what did that church look like? The medieval period was arguably the heyday of the Catholic Church's political power. Popes could wage war and legitimate kings, monasteries were some of, if not solely, the wealthiest landowners in Europe, and the church could collect more in taxes than any royal family. On the macro level, this was obviously a mixture of opulence and privilege that lent itself to a quagmire of corruption. But for the average European peasant, there was no way to know that for sure, and things often looked quite different from the ground at the time than we get to see with the benefit of hindsight. There are probably 100,000 good videos about the church as an organization in the medieval period, so today, we'll be focusing on what a church might have been for its community in that time frame. Now, just a caveat to keep in mind. The medieval period is about 1,000 years long, so we'll be making some broad generalizations, and not all of these things were true for the entirety of the period. To start, where was the church? Naturally, this depended somewhat on where exactly you were. A small countryside village probably had the church figuring quite prominently and centrally, maybe even with its own defensive wall or similar property enclosure. In some small cities or towns, it may be on the property of the manor or castle, and this was undoubtedly true of a castle town. Larger cities may have been built around accommodating a central cathedral, or have had a cathedral added in an easily traversed place. You could, at the very least, count on your local church to be pretty close by, all things considered. As a general rule of thumb, your church would take one of three main forms with a couple of reprising themes. These forms evolved and expanded over time, so we're going to go in a mixture of chronological and architectural scale order. The smallest and earliest form of the medieval church was the church house. Not as glamorous as the later larger cathedral, a church house was actually probably much closer to many suburban churches today. Generally more or less rectangular, these mimicked, though increased the size of, an ordinary medieval house, often indistinguishable from what we might consider a medieval inn, other than religious ornamentation. These were common in the early medieval period, and in small rural communities through later centuries as well. As the church grew in prominence and centered itself in the daily life of Europeans, the basilica emerged. A basilica is actually an ancient Roman invention. Used for tribunals and other public transactions and meetings, a basilica was as much a public forum as it was a place of business. The choice by the church to adopt this type of architecture was intentional. A community's church was much more a public space than we think of them today. Some people, especially women, would visit the church 3 to 5 times in a single day for various penitence rites and prayers. Many of the words that we use to describe church rooms today come from the basilica. So what did a basilica look like when you, the medieval peasant, stepped inside? The narthex was and is an area just inside of a central door, usually on the western side. This wasn't a totally ubiquitous feature of the basilica, but it was enough of a staple that we still use them in church design today. Many basilicas were and are cruciform, shaped like a cross, and thus had transepts, passageways that make the lateral crossways in a cruciform church, and a nave, the central passageway that makes up the body of the cross. While the main ceremonial doors were usually on the west end at the narthex, the transepts would usually contain doors where people could enter for daily use. Beside the ceremonial entrance was usually 2 towers, and around the nave was a section called the aisle. The space where the transepts and the nave intersected was called the crossing, which is fitting, as this would serve as the central area. Clergy would travel down the nave to the crossing and then into an area called the choir or chancel, which you, the medieval peasant, would not be allowed to enter, as clergy and monks would dutifully be working at the altar. But if you look at the map I'm presenting here, you'll notice a section behind that still. That was the ambulatory, which would allow an ordinary person like yourself to get to the radiating chapels, all dedicated to individual prayer or different saints, without stepping into the chancel and getting in the way of the monks. As you can see, the basilica was a big step up from the humble church house, and if you know much about modern church architecture, you probably recognized a few of those names, even from non-cruciform, non-Catholic churches. At this point, many churches began to include porches or atriums, either a, porch, or a sort of outdoor narthex that was basically just a fancy courtyard surrounded by covered aisles. The porch was usually in front of a general use store, and an atrium was traditionally in front of a ceremonial one. In other words, churches got fancy and fast, but with such growth came challenges. Let's say you, medieval peasant that you are, go to your local basilica to listen to a clergyman preach. But standing around the altar, there are 10 to 20 monks performing rites in the chancel area. You can't see the clergyman, and you can't hear him very well either, and he's certainly not going to leave the chancel to come and speak to you directly. Thus, if you're a later medieval peasant, your church probably has a bema, a raised section from which clergy could speak. Now, let's say you're perhaps not a peasant. Maybe you're a merchant or nobility. You won't be caught dead in a church house, and a medium-sized basilica just isn't glamorous enough for you. You want to be in a quality church. Luckily, you've got cathedrals. Now, let me be clear. A medieval cathedral was almost always also a basilica by floor plan and form, and was usually cruciform. But I make this distinction because, well, some of them were just huge. Having been in European local basilicas as compared to grand cathedrals, there's a striking difference in scale. But luckily for your eyes that are probably rolling into the back of your head from all the architectural jabber, they were, again, mostly just a bigger version of a local basilica. So let's go back to being medieval peasants. Stepping inside, you'll see all the things I described before. Once the church has cemented itself as a mainstay of European life, you may also find pilgrims praying at the radiating chapels, beggars just outside the doors, or congregation members doing penitence in the aisles. The church looks and sounds almost like a society of its own, the clergy at the top of the hierarchy, and you most likely near the bottom. So, who were the clergy? Well, in most towns, your clergymen were probably only somewhat more educated than you, especially if you lived out in the countryside. In some places, they may just be a bishop's cousin with no qualifications and an inability to read. But they will still collect your taxes and demand your respect, whether they're men of the quill or drunks who couldn't read the Bible if they wanted to. And that's not an overstatement. In some places, you could well be saddled with a criminal exiled from a noble court, with varying degrees of education. Now, where will the taxes these men, and they are all men, collected go? And what are they asking you to pay? Well, firstly, you are required to pay a tithe, 10% of everything you make. But there's just one problem. In medieval Europe, there is a sizable portion of the population that doesn't even interact with money, so they will collect your harvest instead. This will be placed inside a tithe barn, basically a granary for the taxes they impose on you and the other peasants. This is one of the reasons your church is probably the richest landowner in your town, or even in your city, short maybe of living right next to a royal palace, and even then, only maybe. They get to keep all of it, and they don't have to pay taxes themselves to the crown. You do. That being said, you're probably beginning to notice that the churches of the middle medieval period were quite the large complexes, composed of at least 2 buildings of fairly decent size, maybe more if there was an abbey, monastery, or parsonage attached. And they need lots of money to furnish and build these complexes, and your tithe isn't quite enough. Accordingly, everything you do at a church is monetized, save the actual weekly services if you have them. Baptisms, weddings, and funerals all require an additional fee. One that you are promised will help you in getting out of purgatory and right on to heaven. You probably have a baptismal font, often quite large and deep, that figures prominently in your church for infant and adult baptisms. Now here, many sources will tell you that sins were judged with an ordeal, something you'd more or less see right at home with our mythology about the Salem witch trials, dropping people in water, often the baptismal font, to see if they floated, making them hold hot iron pokers. These are 2 of the most famous ordeals, and technically these were signed into law at some times in some regions. However, evidence for their widespread use is actually often anecdotal, and many historians are beginning to question the validity of the use of such brazen torture as public spectacle and trial. They almost certainly did sometimes happen, but it's difficult to say if you, the medieval peasant, would ever see or experience one in your lifetime. But how did all of these buildings come to be? Your church is certainly a part of your everyday life, and the many rites and worships practiced there are essential to your spiritual health, but the buildings didn't just appear. Someone had to build them. Well, that would probably be your local guild, a group of craftsmen licensed by themselves as a professional organization and monopoling authority to perform labor. They were probably informed of the intention to build or upgrade your local church in advance, and then collected some more taxes from you to build it. Of course, we've been dancing around what is traditionally the most famous use of the church, the worship services. At the time, everybody was Catholic. Well, most everybody. Halfway through the medieval period, the Great Schism created what would come to be known as the Eastern Orthodox Church, but if you lived in most of Europe proper, you were still Catholic. The Protestant Reformation wouldn't come about for another few centuries after the schism, so we can still safely describe your medieval peasant church as being Catholic in nature. Throughout the medieval period, Mass, Catholic worship, developed significantly, ultimately culminating in the Tridentine Mass in the 1500s. Pre-Tridentine Masses were varied by region to region and even church to church, but there was a vague codification that we'll try and follow here. Pre-Tridentine Mass was divided into two parts: the Mass of the catechumens, or people who hadn't yet been baptized, and the Communion of the Faithful. As the period progressed, these became known as the Foremass and the Sacrifice Mass. They would begin with an introductory greeting, which developed into an entrance ceremony. This was followed by scripture readings. Traditionally, this would be followed by a sermon, though as the period progressed, this became more of a common thread than a rule. This was followed by a prayer. After this, in the early period, the catechumens would be dismissed and the remainder of the service would be done only with the baptized. This was followed with the offering of gifts, or the offertory. After this came the Eucharist, the commemoration of Jesus' Last Supper, and the communion rite itself. After this, there was a dismissal of the congregation, which increased in complexity as the period progressed. A lot of the elements of contemporary Catholic Mass, and even Protestant church services, were developed in this period, so you may have recognized some of their names. Your church's service would vary in specifics and grandeur depending largely on region and how far along the medieval period was. By around the year 1000, a much more steadfast set of traditions had developed. So day to day, inside your local, probably guild-built, probably basilica, you would pray. Pray, worship, pay tithes, possibly pay indulgences to get your family out of purgatory, ask saints for blessings, and probably even socialize with community members it would be difficult to meet with outside of Mass. You could enter in through the common doors at any time, and many people did, every single day. As we mentioned before, some people, especially women, made multiple trips. Nowadays, churches are a little more separate from our daily lives. Many of these traditions have died out, but some have persisted, even to this day. The more things change, the more they stay the same.